Primarily ABC, or even object art, as it was called, were terms that were associated with this movement. In philosophical terms, it was the concept of immanence that was being pursued, in contrast to more idealistic or symbolic ventures present in modern art throughout the century. John Cage, to come to him, was a major figure in pursuing this concept of immanence, in opposition to the aesthetic conceptions of his forebearers. Ivan Reiner followed the classes of Robert Dunn, whose teachings were ingrained with Cage's precepts and philosophy. In a text called Looking Myself in the Mouth, which appeared in October number 17 in the summer of 1981, Reiner talks of her ongoing interior dialogue with John Cage, recognizing that Merce Cunningham, with whom she studied for a short while, were major figures in orchestrating an assault on modernism in the late 50s and in the 60s, challenging such notions as the necessity of musical accompaniment, the inadmissibility of everyday movement, the rigid and inviolable separation between humorous, tragic, dramatic, and lyrical forms, the existence of rules governing sequence, climax, development of movement, the relationship of music and movement, or dissonance and harmony. She goes on to develop a critique of the Cagean philosophy. After quoting Cage in the following passage, he says, "This play, however, is an affirmation of life, not an attempt to bring order out of chaos, nor to suggest improvements on creation, but simply a way of waking up to the very life we're living with, which is so excellent, one gets one's mind and one's desires out of its way and lets it act of its own accord." This, I feel, passage describes well the philosophy, for example, of his 4-minute piece. She then goes on to criticize the fact that Cage abandons selectivity and control, whereas she has, as she says, always intuitively brought to bear on Cagean devices in my own work. What are the implications of the Cagean application of principles for assigning importance and significance, she asks, after stating that Cage should be looked at in the perspective of Freudian and Marxist theory. Apparently in those years he had not been looked at in that perspective. She deplores that the fact that for Cage, to address a purposive subject or to grant admission to a mutating finite one would have been to risk becoming re-entangled in those hated measurements of genius and inspiration. But her critique implies that Cage's thinking operates outside of language, in the realm of pure idea, without mind, without desire, without differentiation, without finitude. This outside of language question is a major locus of differentiation between Reiner and Cage. Reiner is preoccupied with affect, emotions, and soon even her work in dance does not satisfy her in bringing about the complexity of the ideas and the emotions she wishes to put forward. Although her dance is truly non-verbal in the sense that it does not ever carry a narrative or any kind of narrative development, as stated before, it is without climax. It does not prevent Reiner constantly using text. However, the text is presented in a contracryptic mode in the context of the performance. For example, she has used excerpts from the diaries of William Bentley, a New England minister, as well as quotes from Leo Bersani, Wittgenstein, or daily newspapers even. But more often, her own texts pop up in her pieces. The lacune she identifies in the reception of Cage in the 60s, that of being bereft of Freudian or Marxist commentary, points to her own desire to engage in emotional as well as political agendas. Nonetheless, Reiner remains at a critical distance using Brechtian strategies when she deals with any material that touches upon these agendas. For example, in one of the versions of Trio A with flags, She and other dancers adorns an American flag while performing the piece. What we see at work here is what is now a classical idiom in describing Rainer's work, that of radical juxtaposition. This act occurred at the time of the Vietnam War protests in the States. Rainer staged a performance called War in 1970, including the M-Walk, which was also used when she organized a march called Street Action in 1970. Marched through New York with a group of dance partners just walking around the block in a solemn way, with each one's head inclined towards the ground in a gesture reminiscent of a sequence in Fritz Lang's Metropolis. A march was also organized in Washington, leading to the White House. The marchers carried a banner saying, "Why are we in Vietnam?" The use of the "we" here is particularly interesting, as it points to a community that questions itself as well as it questions the war. It points back to the "we" as an inclusive factor that purports responsibility as a collective endeavor. Performers in public, citizens, soldiers, politicians are all coextensive in this community and this collective responsibility and questioning. Rainer, in using such a banner and phrasing it this way, expresses a complicity in tackling a subject where affect and police meet. In dealing with gender issues, Rainer develops similar ruses in order to bring forth the ambiguities, contradictions, emotions involved. Although in her latest performances, she has concentrated on women performance and women's issues, she staged numerous performances involving men and women. Her work is often animated by purposefully assigning similar tasks to both, and hence permitting the body-mind relationships of each gender to come to the forefront. Often the performances reveal the inner narratives in the performers' minds on the screen or through monologues that are delivered as part of the material circulating in the piece. In an interview with the Camera Obscura magazine collective in 1976, Rainer comments on the political conceptions in her work. Feeling pressed to find connections or analogues between her radical formalism and radical political concerns, or making a contribution to social political change, she responds with an emphatic no. And she says, "I see myself in the same predicament as many artists who identify themselves or have been identified with the so-called avant-garde. No matter how overtly politicized my work becomes with respect to subject matter, my thinking and making process will always result with a product that appeals to a very select audience, an audience already disposed to share my point of view and appreciate the matter in which it is conveyed." In the same revealing interview, she recognizes the flaw in the idea of the neutral doer, her generation's reaction to the still idealistic dance of Nurse Cunningham. She says, "I wrote that one can't do a grand jeté, one has to dance it. Well, neither can one do a walk without investing it with character. From the beginning, one of the reasons Steve Baxton's, one of her colleagues and friends, walking people were so effective was that the walk was so simply and astonishingly expressive of self." This comment brings us to explore the idea of community that Rainer's work pursues, and which is one of the main reasons why so much attention, again, is being given to her at this time. Continuous Project Altered Daily was a performance which clearly dealt with the workings of community. The choreographer distributed a series of tasks which, combined with a limited number of accessories and instructions, created a work situation for a group of individuals.